Hello everyone, Edain here and welcome back. Today we are going to be going over all the different statistics for units. And by units I mean troops, heroes and cavalry, monsters, the list goes on. Anyway, going to be going over a lot of different numbers, a lot of things that are very basic for new players that may not even know the game or the RTS strategy game in general, and the more advanced type of statistics, which maybe even advanced players or very veteran players probably don't even know about. And this isn't just for the Edain mod, this is Battle for Middle-earth in general. All of these different statistics will come into play when you're playing this game, and a lot of them happen with other RTS games, but they're specifically for Battle for Middle-earth. So if you're not interested in all the little bits of math, then this isn't the video for you. But for everyone that does want to learn a few things about how the game runs in the background, this is for you. So, firstly, starting off with the basic things, just going over firstly costs in resources, which is resource is only the one cost, but every single unit costs resources. And yeah, that is the cost for every single unit. It's unique to that unit. Some units can have discounts on the cost from lots of different ways. Gondor has the townhouses. Angmar has Moddb for the Men of Calm Doom. Knights have farms. Some Siege, I think, gets a discount. I don't think they do, but they might want to make that a thing in the future. And Trolls have things like slaughterhouses. Then we have command points, which is the set cost in like control that you have to have when getting these troops. Every troop has a select amount of command points they cost. So, for example, this entire battalion of Gondor soldiers costs 60 command points in total, split between 15 entities. That is 4 command points per entity. Every entity that dies will reduce the command point total you have built up in your Palantir at the bottom left corner of the map that you can see here, for example. So if one of those entities was to die, that would be 4 more command points. And it's important to know these little things with command points, because those that have played this game for a long time will know you can get a unit down to 1 entity, then make a brand new unit and have that unit come back slowly through regeneration if it has at least 1 level, or if it's near a well and you use the replenish troops ability, and then actually exceed the command point limit. There are a lot of different ways to exceed the command point limit, and that is the best way of doing it. Other ways is just buying more pantries if you haven't already got the command point limit, which in base is 1500 in Edain, and it varies depending on what base game version or mod version you're playing on. Then there's the health of every single entity. As long as they have health, they can exist. If their health ever reaches 0, they die. If you didn't believe me when I was saying we're going through basics, that is very basic. Yeah, every entity has a single health bar, and I always have health bars showing on every entity because I like to try and keep them in the full green as much as possible, which is why I'm a very defensive player. But yeah, every entity's health actually changes the more they level up, and you may not actually know this, but getting heavy armor for your troops also improves their health by quite a considerable amount. That's how they make heavy armor work in Battle for Middle-earth. They just increase the health score and change the armor type. But we'll go over that in a little bit. Next, we have a little something you might not always know about: movement speed. Every entity has a set unit movement speed. Most units move at around 50 movement. Orcs, for example, move at 40, so a little bit slower. Dwarves are also in that category, except for Ered Luin dwarves. And obviously, cavalry move a lot faster, about 110. Trolls move about 70. Siege moves slower, which is why cavalry is so good against them. And then some heroes might be faster. Some abilities can give them extra speed. But yeah, it's always a set value, and a percentage of increase would just give you more speed. And if the percentage is high, you want it on already fast-moving units, so they move even faster. It's crazy how fast you can make some units if you give them more movement speed. But another thing is attack range, because you might not always notice when just going into a brawl, but there is actually different units that will get an attack off first before your opponent because they just have more range to their attacks. For example, a range of 10 on a basic Gondor soldier compared to like a range 20 or 30 of a spearman unit. And obviously, of course, all ranged units have a much larger range, and ranged units that have a lower set range as their cap are normally not considered as good as the more long-ranged variants. For example, Gondor archers are not as long-ranged as Ithilien rangers, which is why these are the more elite troop. And then Carnoon bowmen are the same as the Ithilien rangers, a more elite unit, has more range. And then heroes as well. Faramir, long range with his bow. Boromir, short range with his sword. Gandalf, short range with his sword. Trebuchets have probably the longest range. All ranged artillery has the furthest range in the game, which is why you need to go into melee with them, or have siege to counter them. And then a unit like a troll will actually have about, I think, 30 attack range. So while units are actually moving up towards them to hit them, he can already get a good punch off on them, knocking them down and making them useless against the troll, which is why monsters in Edain and Battle for Middle-earth in general have always been really strong. And then single entities like the Berserker is actually weaker in most instances because it still has the shorter range of a swordsman and not a longer range, despite the fact it has a very large sword that it wields. Next is this is where we start getting into the more complicated stuff. Firstly is attack speed. Every entity has a varying speed in which they attack. And if you go into the Edain wiki, you will actually see the different values for attack speed. The more the lower the value on the Edain wiki, so for example, a swordsman has 1500 as their attack speed, but a horseman has an attack speed of 1100. That means it takes the cavalry unit less time to make 2 strikes than it takes the Gondor soldier unit to make 2 strikes. And the knight unit can make 4 strikes in the time they would make 4 strikes as well. But that is also if, again, you're just going in a full-on brawl. You're not killing each other in one hit. You're constantly just whacking at the enemy, dealing damage, but you're never actually getting moved out of range. So whenever you move into range, you're always getting the attack off immediately. But then you've got to have that little wind-up before you get to do the extra attack. And that is the attack speed parameter. And there aren't a lot of things that can actually increase attack speed of units. Sometimes that's why running away and an enemy chasing can actually do more attacks per second because it's being reset. But sometimes it actually falls into the same category again of same speed units. You'll get one hit off, then you'll have to do the whole recharge because you're still in melee with them as they're running away, and you hit them again that little time sooner. But if they're actually slower, you'll actually start overtaking them and actually hit a different entity at a different point in time, making faster attacks. If that makes any sense. It makes sense to me, but it may not make sense to some people. So, for example, I just made an example. But yeah, another thing would be swordsman engaging with spearman. The swordsman is just 1 pixel away from being in range, but the spearman's already in range. They get 1 attack off. The swordsman has to wait a little bit longer before it gets hit its first hit off. But the spearman moves slower in its attack speed, while the swordsman moves faster in its attack speed. The swordsman might actually get a second hit off before the spearman gets its second hit off. And then obviously, if the swordsman kills the spearman in front, it will then have to move to the next entity, and then when it's in position, it will make an automatic hit again. So that's how attack speed and movement speed work. Next up, we have trample and revenge damage. Trample damage, also known as crush damage when you're looking at the armor values, but we'll go into that in a second again, is any unit that has a trample damage in its damage types. So, for example, cavalry and monsters, and some abilities like the unburnt charge, and some other key abilities, but mainly just cavalry and monsters. When they charge in, they will do a set amount of damage, and then you check, and then the damage of that trample checks the crush resistance of the armor of the unit is attacking, and then it does that much damage to the entity. And then if the entity dies, then it's dead. But if it survives, it just gets knocked down and has to get back up again. But at the same time, any entity that has a revenge damage type, so for example, you're charging into a unit of swordsmen, their revenge damage is going to be very low because they're not made to counter cavalry charges. Meanwhile, a spearman unit will have a much higher revenge damage because their job is to stop cavalry. So even though they might get knocked down and take damage, they'll be dealing a lot more damage out to the units. And then every time a unit tramples, every entity it tramples decelerates its movement, and then when its movement hits a certain point, it no longer counts as trampling, and it won't deal trample damage, but it won't take revenge damage either. Which is why in some instances, if you're in a pickle, but you're against a low tier spearman unit like Mord or pikeman, instead of charging into them, just move at them, then press the S key, and then just let the swordsman swing at them with their other damage type, since that doesn't do revenge damage to the units, so you'll get more value out of it. And then same thing goes with trolls. Their deceleration is a lot less, same with Ents. They normally just keep trampling over entities, after entity after entity. But again, the same problem goes with, you crush spearmen, they're going to die a lot faster than cavalry would. Which is why, when you know you're playing against a faction that has monsters, you should always prepare spearmen. And the main factions that have monsters are obviously Mordor and Misty Mountains. Always have pikemen prepared for both of those factions. And another thing to note is, the crush damage on cavalry and monsters, though it shows 1%, that's basically the game's way of saying, because it is an old game, that they don't take crush damage, because you can't trample a cavalry unit with a cavalry unit. The only exception to that rule is Mumakil, but that is a completely different monster all to itself. Okay, and now we get to the difficult bits. Firstly, the damage types of every single unit. I have up here a different damage type. Oh, I just remembered. There's one more I want to add in. I know it's not a unit, but it is a type of damage. And all these different types of damage, it's not like every single unit has this does 45 damage, this does 45 damage, this does 45 damage. And if they all attack this berserker at once, they'll all do 45 damage. Nope, instead, this unit has 45 slash damage, this unit has 45 specialist damage, and this has 45 pierce damage. And against a berserker in particular, the slash damage will do an average amount, the specialist damage will do less, and the pierce damage will do about the same as the slash damage, but just at range. So it could take, in total, 90 from the pierce and the slash, but maybe only 30 from the specialist because of its armor type, its armor set, as it's known in the Edain wiki, but I keep calling it armor type. But yeah, each damage type is displayed here, well, at least all the ones that are used in the Edain mod. There are actually a few more named damage types which you would have to give to then have the armor type recognize what it is and then go off from there. But if it's not recognized, it goes to the default, and I'll have something up here in a bit that will just show all the different damage types that are recognized in an armor class for units. But firstly, let's just go over every single damage type that is common in this game and mod and etc. etc. Firstly, as I mentioned, slash damage. If you see a swordsman, it is probably going to have slash damage as its damage type. It slashes, and so it can cut through spearmen quite easily. but that is about it. Otherwise, it is just all around a good type of damage, and you'll see it in every faction in a lot of units. Then we have specialist damage, which is mostly used for dealing with cavalry and monsters, as the spear is much more effective against a unit that it can pierce into than it is a swordsman, who is more likely to be able to buckle and parry against it, if that makes any sense. But that's just me going over stuff that doesn't make sense yet. And I've just got the Fountain Guard here because they can actually switch between slash and specialist damage. But even though they can do that, their trample revenge damage is always the same. That's the same with every unit. Every unit still has the trample revenge damage that it has if it changes its type of damage. Same with the Palantir Guards, the Numenor Traitors. I think that's all the ones I can think of. Then it becomes a bit more of a complex type of damage. We have chop damage, and that is used by several different units. Very unique units. You don't see a lot of them. But chop damage is what is a damage type that is more effective against units that don't have heavy armor as their armor set. And the way you know that is because they don't have heavy armor. If you purchase heavy armor, for example, for a unit of Gondor soldiers, this unit's damage will go way down. But if in the early game, for example, you're fighting that Gondor soldier one-on-one, more likely this unit will come out on top because the chop damage does an average of 50% more damage to most unit types. And then next we have Uruk damage, which even though I've used a Berserker as my indicator for the damage type, it's not actually reliant to only Urukai. It is a more unique damage type that is only accessible on, again, very few units. The Berserker and the Kirith Ungol Urukai. I know I'm saying it's just a bunch of Uruk, but it's not just all Uruks. Any damage that says they negate heavy armor, it basically means they're getting Uruk damage, because if a unit has heavy armor, the Uruk damage can do more damage to that unit, just meaning that it is effective against units that don't have heavy armor, but is also more effective against units that do have heavy armor. So chop damage falls off, but Uruk damage will always thrive. Then we have the pierce damage, which is mostly given to these ranged units here. Specialist damage does actually get given to the spear thrower units, for example from Ered Mithrin and the Rohan spear throwers. And axe throwers actually have slash damage, if you didn't know. If I hadn't said it before in a video and you didn't know before. Axe throwers do slash, spear throwers do specialist, archers do pierce damage. And pierce damage is really weak against buildings, as you can imagine. Shooting a building with an arrow is more likely to ping off it than actually do any damage. But then you get some unique damage types when you get the upgrades for your archer units. For example, with Athenian range you get fire arrows, which do the flame damage type. Or you can get frost arrows that give the frost damage type. And frost and flame aren't obviously given only through these kinds of upgrades. Anything that is a fire-based attack is flame. So most of the Balrog's abilities, Saruman's fireball, and obviously fire arrows are the main types of flame damage. Oh, and flaming munitions, for example, from the trebuchet gets flame damage. But for example, frost comes from these ice munitions through the frost shots for the Angmar catapult, and avalanche, for example, is another one. And then you can also, if you wanted to, you could also say Lothlorien units get magic damage, which is an even rarer, more powerful version of flame or frost. Is an elemental damage, and magic is far superior to flame and frost in most instances. Next up, I'm going to avoid these for now. I'm going to go to cavalry. You have basic cavalry damage, which is the sword swing from the knight, not the trample, only the sword swing. The trample damage is the trample damage, as it is named separately in the unit's statistics. You can again read all about this in the Edain wiki. And then you've got ranged cavalry, or cavalry ranged, which is actually not just specific to ranged cavalry. Even though you can get this unit, the Rohirrim archers and the elk riders, if you get Uruk-hai crossbowmen and upgrade them with the steel bolts, they will get cavalry ranged, because cavalry ranged actually ignores heavy armor. Again, exactly the same as Uruk damage. So even though the damage might not be as great against all entities, if you're focusing heavy armor units, you can still see some decent damage. And then again, with the Rohirrim archers, you can get flame arrows. Elk riders, you can get silverthorn arrows for magic damage. And that's why I don't like the Uruk-hai crossbowmen, because all they get is just cavalry ranged as their damage type, which on its own is not good. Then we have, which you wouldn't guess the name for, is water damage, which coexists with monsters, mostly trolls and ents. There are a few more exceptions to the rule, but those are the two main users of water damage. And water damage is probably one of the more destructive ones. It's not classed as elemental damage, despite the fact it's called water. It's just they had to use a name, and the water was the name. So that is why it's called water. Don't ask me why. That's just how the game was made by EA decades ago. Then we have siege damage, which goes to all siege units and the pitch throwers of Rohan. Siege damage is really good against buildings. If you hadn't guessed, every siege attack from a siege unit does massive damage to buildings compared to everything else. So of course siege damage is very good against buildings. But siege damage is also just good against most enemies. Not a lot is resistant to siege damage, but there are ways to gain siege resistance through characters like Beragond. And then we have poison damage, which I couldn't get a good indicator for who I was going to get, so I decided sorcerers. Thing about it, Corpse Rain is poison damage. Poison damage is a DOT effect that, again, not a lot of enemies are resistant to. Very few things give resistance to poison, because poison is only used by Dol Guldur, sorcerers, the Blight or / Plague, or whatever it's called, for Angmar, and very little else. The Gomrugan and the Druidine. There we go. That's another example of poison damage. And yeah, it's just DOT damage. The amount of damage dealt through poison isn't normally specified, but it does exist, and it normally is just a small trickle of health, which is why you don't see it do a lot to a lot of high health entities. For example, a troll, which has 8,000 health if given armor. Poison is going to do literally nothing to that health bar, even though it is every second or every... I don't actually know how many times it triggers per second, but yeah, poison you normally don't see do anything. It normally needs a lot of triggers all at once, similar to Blight, to have any real grand-threatening effects. Which, to be fair, the poison damage on that is absurd. And then, lastly, I almost forgot, structure damage. Structures do deal damage, and they always seem to do the exact amount of damage, same amount of damage, no matter what armor you have. Heavy armor, they just do more damage. Structure damage is very similar to Uruk damage, cavalry range damage, in that no matter what you are, you're going to get damaged by it. Siege being one of the only exceptions. And now we come to, firstly, magic damage, which is wielded by certain sorcerers, but other entities as well. For example, with the Silverthorn arrows for Lothlorien, heroes like Gandalf wield magic damage, but the main source of damage that heroes use is hero damage. That's very original name. Yes, it's very good. And also hero range damage. So any unit, any hero that does hero damage is striking at melee, and any unit that has hero range damage is shooting from range. Yes, it's very, very obvious. And then, lastly, talking about armor sets. So, firstly, all units have a unique armor set. There's actually so many I couldn't name them with all my fingers and toes combined. It's a crazy number, but you'll typically see a Gondor, for example, a Gondor soldier unit, and a Rohan peasant unit, and a dwarf unit, and a Lothlorien unit, all those swordsman units are going to have the exact same armor type, armor set. And then if you give them heavy armor, if they can get heavy armor, they'll have the heavy armor set. And then more elite units will have a slightly better armor set. For example, the heroic Fountain Guard, they have a much better armor set overall compared to these units, even with heavy armor, just because they are a more elite unit, so they get better things. It makes sense, trust me. And then archers, for example, they're made, so their armor set makes them really, really weak to getting struck in melee, but most importantly, getting trampled by cavalry. They take immense crush damage. And then there's things like heroes that take next to no damage from everything, except for other heroes, because, you know, the hero killers have to do something. And then siege damage, as I've already mentioned, take very little to pierce damage. And then monsters take mostly damage from specialist and pierce, because those are the two types of entity damage that can really cling on to them really well, where slash damage can barely get through a tough hide or bark of an ent, for example. And yeah, that is pretty much everything. That is all the statistics. I guess one thing I didn't mention was the recruit speed of units, which is, again, another basic thing. Whenever you recruit a unit, it has a set amount of time. Certain abilities like Call the Horde reduce that time to next to nothing by making it a massive percentage, so it only takes a second to recruit. But that is the basic thing. Again, anyone who didn't know that, well, now you know. And yeah, I've hopefully edited in a nice little bit that shows the different armor classes for different types of units, so that you can have an idea of what it all looks like from a purely numerical standpoint. And I hope you've all learned something from this video. And I will see you all next time. Farewell.